Hello everyone, this is a complete tutorial of my newest handbag, the Madeleine Handbag. So there are 6 pattern pieces that come with the pattern and complete instructions with 52 full color photos as well as this tutorial. So I won't be including any measurements or anything like that in this video. You'll have to get that from the pattern, which you can get from my website, roguestitches.com. There's a link down below in the description. So let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to need is our exterior front and back pieces. There are 4 of them. I'm going to move all of these other pieces out of the way and we will bring them over as needed. So there's a left and a right, a front and a back. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay them on our surface side by side the way they're going to be on the bag, and then we're going to flip one side over on top of the other and match up the longest edge and put clips on that. We're going to go over to the machine and sew that along this longest edge using the seam allowance given in the pattern. Okay, so since the exterior of my bag is a black vinyl, I'm going to be using black thread for my main stitches, and then when I top stitch, I'm going to be switching over to a red thread because I want it to sort of pop against the black and it's going to coordinate with my lining. So let's stitch these 2 lines of stitching here, and don't forget to use a standard stitch length, that's your structural stitch length, and back stitch at the beginning and end. You might be tempted to use double-sided adhesive to hold this in place. Not a good idea, considering you're going to need to spread that seam allowance open when we do our top stitching. Anywhere in the pattern where it says top stitch, that references a longer stitch length, not going to be a structural stitch length, it's simply decorative. Okay, so for the top stitching portion, I like to lay it with the exterior facing down, so the right side facing down. And I'm just going to spread open this seam allowance and give it a good finger press. Now at this point you could use double-sided adhesive if you wanted on either side of the seam allowance just to hold it open while you're stitching, but it isn't necessary. So I'm just going to give these a good finger press. And then I'm going to switch out my thread for my red thread and top stitch. And then I will have to switch it back over. It's a little more tedious with an industrial machine. With a lot of domestic machines, threading, happens pretty quickly. And this pattern should be able to be made on pretty much any domestic machine. So let's go over and get this top stitching done with our red thread. Okay, so as you can see here, I have left the bobbin thread black and I have a red thread through the top of my machine. So I'm going to turn my work, my panel, so that it is exterior side up or right side up. And I'm going to start at the bottom just because I want to back stitch at the beginning and the end. I know you don't typically do that with top stitching, but I'm just an oddball that way. I'm going to start on one side 1/8 of an inch from the seam and move to a top stitching length. And that length really is just preference. Now I'm going to stop periodically with my needle down and raise my work up and get under there and flatten that seam out. And then I'm going to continue down that seam. Now take your time. Always make sure you stop with your needle down and keep your foot positioned with the edge that you're keeping up with so that you have a nice straight top stitching. Now when I get to the end, I'm going to go right off the end. I'm going to turn my work around and go down the other side. Again, making sure that that seam allowance is open. Cut my threads, and then you should have some nice and neat top stitching that goes right down that center seam. So I'm going to do the other panel, and then I will meet you back at the counter to set up for the next step. Okay, so for this part, we're going to take the two panels and lay them right sides together. And the most important thing we're going to do is line up those seams at the bottom. So I'm going to pick it up and just make sure that those seams are lined up. I'm going to put a clip right there. And then I'm just going to level out and line everything up as best I can. Now, things might look like they're a little bit off in some places. That's okay. We can fix that in the seam allowance when we stitch everything together. So I'm not too worried about that. So we're going to go over and stitch right across the bottom. I've already switched out my thread, and I'll be right back over here after we're done with that. So now we've stitched across the bottom. We are not going to top stitch that seam just yet. We will be top stitching, but the next thing we need to do is prepare our bottom stabilizer and get that ready to go. Okay, so at this point we're ready to do the bottom of the bag. Now this particular pattern has the front and back top stitched, the bottom is top stitched, and so are both of the sides. So it's a little fiddly to work with, but you can do it. So the bottom seam is the one that I really recommend after you've stitched it to use double-sided adhesive. And I'm just going to run a line down both sides of this seam allowance. Okay, I'm going to give that a good burnish so that it's pressed down nicely. And you can even use a brayer or a seam roller on that just to make sure you've got good adhesion. Okay. One thing that I've already done, and you'll find the instructions for this in the pattern, is I have marked the center of all four sides of my stabilizer panel. And my stabilizer panel happens to be 2 layers of Decoville, and this Decoville Heavy, as it's referred to by a lot of people, because I was looking for about the same thickness as I would get with Peltex, which is what I was using in a lot of the first ones of these that I made. I've made about 5 or 6 so far. And I find that I like the thickness of the Peltex, but I just was out of it and happen to have Decoville on hand. So that's what I'm using. So I've marked the center of all 4 sides, and you'll see why in just a moment. So we're going to open up our panel, and we're going to need a few clips for this. Longer clips work best. And I'm going to pull off one side of the backing of my tape, and I'm going to start in the middle just because that's where I like to start. And I'm going to press open, and I'm trying not to stretch the vinyl as I'm pressing it open, meaning stretch it toward the sides. A lot of vinyl does have just a little bit of stretch. It doesn't have much, but it can kind of stretch as you're moving with it. So I'm just going to press that open. Then I'm going to pull the backing off the other side and push that side back. And again, finger pressing is just fine. I just like to use my brayer. So this is where those marks on your bottom stabilizer panel come in handy. So what we're going to do is center our stabilizer panel over our bottom seam, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to line those marks that we made up with all 4 areas where it intersects the seam. So you can see here I'm lining up with the seam, again on both of the sides and at the bottom. There we go. So just to hold that in place, I'm going to flip my clip upside down because I'm going to be top stitching from the right side of the material, and I'm just going to pop a couple of clips on each side to hold that where it needs to be. Upside down. Okay, and then we're going to flip that over and top stitch down one side and back up the other, just like we did with these 2 seams over at the machine. right, so now we have this beautiful intersection of top stitching here on the bottom of the bag. Look how pretty. Okay, that's one of the things I love about contrasting top stitching on a bag like this, is because you can really make it shine. So you may notice that here could be a little bit of pucker in your work. That's fine. It's sort of by design. When the bag is folded up, it won't even be noticed, especially considering that cute little accent we have, the dimple, I call it, on the front of the bag at each corner. So if you notice, when we did our top stitching, it has secured our stabilizer to the bottom of the bag, which is one of the reasons that I wasn't really worried about having it fused to the bag. So now let's move on to the next step. Now I'm going to mark these markings off camera because you have the measurements for all of those in the back inside the pattern, because you have the measurements for all of that in the pattern, but I will show it to you here on camera once I get the markings made. So I'll be right back. So I've decided to go ahead and show you the markings on the pattern in the video because I'm afraid there might be a little bit of confusion on how the marks need to be placed, just because it sometimes happens. So what I'm going to do is this flat or this angled area here, where normally when we box our corners we would have two straight lines. We'd have basically a box out of the corner. Well, this time we have about a 1-inch width at an angle from the two lines that are already there, from the 90-degree lines. So I'm going to center my 1-inch up on that area, and I'm going to place 3 marks. 1 in the center and 1 1/4 of an inch either side of that. So the 1/4 inch lines can stay just like that. They don't really need to be any longer because they're just a reference point. So for that center line, I want to line the 5/8 inch line of my mat, of my ruler, up with that edge of the material. And I'm going to draw a line that is 5/8 inch long right there in the center. Center, 1/4, 1/4 from either side of it. Now I'm going to take my 1-inch line on my ruler and line it up on the edge of the material. That 1/2 inch mark on my ruler should be lined up with the 5/8 inch line. There, that's a lot better. Now I'm going to make about a 1/2 inch mark straight across the edge of my ruler that runs perpendicular to that 5/8 inch line. So we should have 4 marks. 1 at a 1/4 inch, 1 at a 1/2 inch, and 1 at a 1/4 inch. That center 1/2 inch should be 5/8 inches long, and then there should be a perpendicular line above the 5/8 inch line that is about a 1/2 inch. You can put a smaller mark if you like, but I just like to do the 1/2 inch so that I can see where I'm going. I promise there is a point. So now the next thing that we need to do is we're going to cut each one of those 5/8 inch lines. I know it's scary. So I'm just going to take my scissors and cut so that we have this. I'm going to do that on all 4 of them. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to grab some clips really quickly. And I'm going to flip this over so that it is right side up. And I'm going to fold my material on that 5/8 inch line. And I'm going to line up these edges here. So this corner should line up with this corner. Okay. And now I'm going to put a clip right here on this edge just to hold it in place. You can even put one back here if you like. So we're going to sew the dart here, and we're going to start at the edge of the material, right on that 1/4 inch from that 5/8 inch line. And we're going to sew at an angle up to the edge of the material where that perpendicular line is. So from here to here. So once I get all of these clipped, we will go over to the machine and get that next step done. Okay, again, I am going to start at the edge of the material right there where that little mark is that I made, and sew at an angle until my needle reaches the edge of the material at this mark here. I'm going to do that on all 4 sides. So this is what you should have. So the next thing that we're going to do is stitch up the sides of the bag. Now in the pattern, I tell you to do one side, top stitch, and then do the other side. But for the sake of this tutorial and saving myself the headache of switching up my thread so much, I'm not going to do it quite in that order. I'm going to go ahead and stitch up both sides and then top stitch. So sorry if this doesn't line up exactly with the pattern, but with me deciding that I'm going to use the same color thread as the exterior of the bag to stitch it up, and then a separate color, a contrasting color for top stitching, it's just easier for me this way. Now the reason I have you do it the other way in the pattern is because it's easier to top stitch when one side is open. So at least one side will be easier to top stitch than the other. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to stitch down this side. I'm going to flip it over and then stitch down this side. The reason I'm doing that is because if I stitched down and then up, then it could get skewed a little bit and we don't want that. So I'll see you at the machine. Okay, so at this point we have our side seams stitched together, or in your case, if you're following more the pattern than the tutorial, you'll have one side stitched together. Both sides are done pretty much exactly the same. So what I'm going to do here is kind of press this down against with the right sides together and finger press this seam open. Now, if it would be easier for you here to go ahead and add some double-sided adhesive, just so that you don't have to fiddle with it as much while you're top stitching, then go ahead and do that. Absolutely. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and do that too on this one. I like to fiddle with it a little less too. I'm going to go ahead and add some double-sided adhesive. And I haven't done this with any of the other ones, but it might make it a little bit easier to do this top stitching without having to go back and fiddle with it underneath to keep that seam allowance open. So I'm just running it down both sides of the seam allowance, and then I'll remove the backing and finger press that open. You absolutely do not have to do this. You just have to be really careful when you're doing the top stitching, and go slow and make sure that that seam allowance stays open. But it can really be fiddly when you're top stitching inside a bag. So I have those done. So now what I'm going to do is kind of push the side down so that it's right sides together. And you can mush all this out of your way. I'm only going to peel off one at a time. I'm not going to peel off this side and press it down yet, because it might come loose when I'm maneuvering and fiddling the bag around to get that top stitching done. So I'm going to back my camera away from my machine just a little bit so that you can get a better view of what I'm having to do to get the top stitching. Okay, so we're over at the machine and I have the side that I've pressed open facing down on my machine. Now the rest of this bag, I'm literally just going to mush it out of the way. And I'm going to start on the top edge this time. I'm going to stitch all the way down, turn my work, and come back up. So I can already tell that having this seam allowance pressed open beforehand and kept open with the double-sided adhesive is going to be a lot easier. So we're just going to get in there. Make sure when you stop that you stop with your needle down, and just take a few stitches at a time if you have to, and then readjust. Now at some point you can get up here with your fingers and kind of peek down. I'm literally, my head is like peeking down into the top of this bag right here. Just so, and you can move your light so that you can see in there. Careful not to press the foot when you're not looking. So just keeping it straight, kind of pressing things out of the way. And one thing you want to make sure not to do is to sew the bottom of your bag. So you want to make sure that you're keeping that separated. And I don't know how well you can see that, but I'm just using my fingers here to pull the bottom of the bag away from the side there where we're going to box the corner. That way I'm not hitting the bottom of the bag. So now I'm going to lift my presser foot and just spin everything around, pushing the bottom of the bag out of the way at the back, lining things up. And you see I've really got it embushed, and that's okay. Stop with your needle down, get that thread out of the way, and just work your way down the other side. There we go. There's one side of our top stitching done. And I'll stand the back up here and kind of show you the inside there. Got that really nice line of top stitching that we have. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. I'm going to press this in on itself. I'm going to pull off the backing of the tape, press it open, just like the other side, and then top stitch. Okay, so at this point, this is a very crucial point. So you can see here that our box at our corners do not look like a typical boxed corner. Normally this would be flat, right? Okay, so that's because we're about to create those dimples that you see on the front and the back of the bag at the corners. And it also creates a little more width in the bag as far as depth of the gusset. So rather than being just the width of our stabilizer, those dimples sort of push out the sides of the bag and create a more rounded, fuller look rather than having just boxy corners. So what we're going to do at this point is I'm just going to kind of mash in the sides of my bag. It's okay, it doesn't hurt. It isn't going to hurt it. It isn't going to hurt it. I'm going to flip it upside down so that I am looking at the bottom stabilizer of this portion of the bag. So what we're going to do here, first and foremost, is we're going to line up those center seams and clip it, just like that. So now this next step is going to create the dimple. So you see we have these horns, or the little cat ears sticking out here at the side, right? These little cat ears. Normally when we box a corner, it'd just be straight across. This one is not for a purpose. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold that cat ear over top of our stabilizer, lining up the edge with the box edge of our corner. And the fold should be right on that point that was inside. And I'm going to clip it there and then again over here just to hold it in place. So right here, I'm going to show this again. I'm going to flip that over, so that it is laying against, the edges are lined up and it's laying over top of the stabilizer. Okay, so you're going to have something that looks like this. The side is going to be folded over. You're going to think, what the heck? This looks like garbage. It's not going to turn out okay. No, it is, I promise. So I'm going to zoom the camera in a little bit, and I'll show you the other side. Okay, so this is what we have here. These are our little cat ears. So what we're going to do is fold it over so that the edges here line up. And we're going to pop a clip on it. There and there, just to hold it in place. Again, we're going to fold it right at that corner point so that these edges line up here. And we're going to put a clip on it. There and over here, just to hold it in place. Okay? So now you've got something that looks like this. I promise it'll turn into a bag. So now we're going to go over and stitch across here and box our corner, catching all of those layers on the side. So see you over there, Michelle. Okay, now that we've done that, you can see here we've got this interesting shape, and we have our stabilizer tucked up underneath those. We want that to stay there. We're going to now flip this right side out. When we do that, we can go back in there. You can see how those corners kind of pop out, especially if you sew along the edge of it. Now you could sew right along the top of the stabilizer there and it wouldn't make much difference, but it would hold that in place. I'm actually going to go in there with my finger and just press the corners back up underneath. Just like that. So you can see in there how it's pressed up underneath that little that dimple that we just created. So that when the bag is turned out, you have these adorable little dimples. And that is by design. It wasn't a mistake, I promise. So you can kind of press this out. It's another reason I don't trim the seam allowance on the edges, is it really does help to create the shape that we're going for on this bag. So you can see here we have the top stitching. It goes down the side and all the way across to the other side, and again on the front and all the way around the back. All right, so now we'll move on to getting the lining ready. Okay, so at this point we have finished the exterior of our bag. I've chosen which one I want to be the front. It doesn't matter as long as your top stitching is nice and straight. Pick whichever one you like because they're the same on either side, and I've added my logo to it. So if you're going to add a logo label to your bag, now would be a good time to do that. So I'm going to set the exterior aside and we'll move on to the next couple of steps, which I have done offline because they require measurements, of course, and you can get that from the pattern. So I've already drawn the box on the exterior of my lining. We're not going to sew that on yet. We're going to do that after we attach the top part, the facing, to the bottom part of the lining. So I've marked my box, and I've also added a piece of duct tape to the center back of both of my facing pieces, and I've marked where my hardware is going to go. And there is a dot on the pattern, so you'll be able to use the pattern to do that. I've also added a bit of double-sided adhesive across the bottom of each of my my facing pieces, so that it's going to be, I don't have to worry about clips or anything. It's going to be easy to attach. So, of course, with right sides together, I'm going to remove the backing. If you're not using double-sided adhesive, feel free to go ahead and clip that in place. I'm just going to kind of line this up centered along that edge. Make sure the edges are lined up nicely, and I'm going to press that in place. I'll do that with the other one as well. And then I'm going to take these over to the machine and stitch across. Now when top stitching this part, we're not going to open the seam allowance. We are going to top stitch it to the lower lining. So we're going to top stitch it to this. So all of the seam allowance is going to be pressed toward the lower part. And I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this with black thread because it's contrasting to the material that it's going to be on. So I'll see you over at the machine. Okay, so we're back over at the machine. And we're just going to stitch down the side with a regular structural stitch length. Back stitching at the beginning and end. Okay, so for this part, I'm going to open this up. I'm going to flip it over with the upper part underneath and just roll back the lining piece and finger press that down so that you can see here all of the seam allowance is pressed toward the lower lining. And then I'm going to go to a top stitching length and stitch on the lower lining portion for both panels. Okay, so now we have our two lining pieces assembled, the facing and the lower lining. And as you can see here on the back, we have our snap placement marked out and our pocket. Now the reason we drew this first is so that we could get the measurement more accurately, a little more easily actually. And the reason we didn't attach the pocket lining before attaching the top panel is just so that we didn't catch our pocket lining in that seam, because it would have been easy to do. So now we're going to take our pocket lining, we're going to flip this over and find the center on the grid mat. I am big about using my grid mat for this. So I'm going to line up the bottom and the sides as best as I can. I'm going to find the center of my pocket. I'm just going to put a little crimp in it. And you can even use your ruler. Just lay it up against that seam there so that one of the lines is lined up with your grid mat. And then you're going to take that little tick mark that you just made by folding it in half and line it up with the seam on center. And I'm going to put a couple of pins in that so that it doesn't move. Make sure that when you're putting the pins in there, you're not putting them in the way of where you're going to be sewing. So now we're going to take this over to the machine and we're going to sew a line across the top and the bottom of the rectangle that we made. Now normally when I use waterproof canvas, I would be using my alternate welt pocket method, and I'm going to put a card for that up in the corner. But for this one, I'm going to do it the way that I am doing inside the pattern, since I did the pattern for use with a woven material. I just felt like using vinyl on this one, or the waterproof canvas on this one. So I'll see you over at the machine. Okay, so we're going to go down one side, back stitching at the beginning and the end, turn and go up the other side. And I like to lift my presser foot and watch where the needle is dropping down so that I can get it right on that corner. Okay, now that we've sewn our line across the top and the bottom, now if you want to sew the complete rectangle and do the sides as well, fine. I just find that I get a much neater finish on the inside of the bag with less puckers at the corner if I only sew the top and bottom, but you can do it whichever way works best for you. So now I'm going to use my ruler and I'm going to cut open that center line using my rotary tool. Not going all the way to the end, as you can see there, and then I'm going to take my scissors and very carefully, making sure not to cut my stitches, I'm going to go up to the corner. There we go. So now at this point what I like to do is finger press my seam allowances back away from the actual stitching on both sides. And I'm going to use my brayer just to get a good press on that. I find that, again, this just helps everything lay nicely once it's turned through. And I do the same thing with the corner. I can just kind of burnish that with my nail. Okay, so now that all of that is sort of burnished down, I'm going to push everything through to the back side. Now you're welcome to press it. You want to press it from the front and avoid your vinyl and the back of your waterproof canvas. You can kind of roll these seams between your fingers. Give them a little press just to make sure that everything is straight. Now I will say in the alternate welt pocket method, there is no exposed zipper tape inside the pocket. So you won't see the edges of the zipper tape because they're going to be between the two layers. They're going to be between the pocket lining and the exterior, or the lining portion. So I'm going to put a little bit of double-sided adhesive right here along the seam allowance of the upper part because it's shorter and it wants to roll back. This is just going to help it stay back where I want it. And I'm not doing it on the lining material itself because that can hinder me closing up the pocket when I'm ready to do that. And that'll stay back a little more easily. So I have my pull on my zipper tape, and I like to actually push the pull all the way over until it's about a ½ inch from the end. That way when I place my pocket down on it, I know that that is going to be, there's a little lump created by the zipper pull. That is going to be even with the location that the zipper pull is going to be on the bag. And then I can run my fingernails along the coil just to make sure that my tape is nice and straight. You can iron your tape, but I find with this particular type of zipper tape or zipper by the yard, it's not really necessary. So I'm going to make sure that my pocket lining opening is nice and straight and the seams are pressed down nicely. So I'm going to burnish these, and then once I've done this, I'm going to run some double-sided adhesive across the top and bottom of the opening. Now I'm going to line my zipper tape up on my grid mat and then center that opening over the top of the zipper, lining the left side up with the zipper pull, and press the top part in place. And then I'm going to flip the bottom up and remove the tape backing. and then press that in place, making sure that my zipper pull is out of the way. I do have to move it. You may notice a difference in the audio here. It's because I did not realize that my battery pack on my mic had died, so there was no audio, so I have to do a voiceover for this part. So, a couple of issues. My mic died, and I forgot to switch the camera view, but I've basically just top stitched around the opening where I attached the zipper over at the counter. And now I'm going to flip up this pocket portion of the lining and match it up with the top corners and put a couple of clips on it. And then I'm going to sew up one side, across the top, and down the other side. If you notice, I'm placing my clips upside down because I'm going to be sewing from the other side so that we can move our lining out of the way as we're sewing the pocket lining. So we're going to flip this over and roll the lining back out of the way. And using a structural stitch length, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end, we're going to sew around. So that has our pocket closed up and our zipper attached, so we can see inside our pocket there. Okay, so now we're going to attach our magnetic snaps according to the manufacturer's directions. And again, I like to put the duct tape there just to protect the material. So I'm going to use, I'm going to use the washer that comes with a magnetic snap and center it over that mark that I made. And then I'm just going to use my marker to draw a line through those two gaps on it. And that's where I'm going to make my cuts for the magnetic snap to go in. You can use your seam ripper for that. Just poke your seam ripper in and cut the hole open with the tiny blade that's in your seam ripper, but I happen to have this Tula Pink blade on hand. Scalpel, that's what I was trying to think of. So it doesn't really matter which side you put your male or female on. I like to do the male on the back side, so that's going to be the side where the zipper is at. So once you have your snaps attached, you should be able to snap those together, and your bag pieces, both sides of your lining, should pretty much line up like so. So now what we're going to do is sew down each side, and then we're going to sew maybe 1.5 inches on each side of the bottom. I like to first line up these side seams and clip them in place, and then sew from top to bottom on both sides. Now the reason we do that, instead of sewing down and around, is so that nothing shifts. Because it can and sometimes does shift, and that can leave your pieces a little wonky. So if you're sewing from top to bottom on both sides, if it shifts, it's going to shift the same on both. So I'm going to grab my clips and go ahead and clip this. So I've clipped this side because I'm going to be starting from the top and working down. So when I do the other side, I'm going to flip it over and line up my pieces. and clip from this side. That way my clips are facing up. And then once I go down whichever side, then I can do the bottom part. And I'm just going to put a couple of clips, making sure that it's lined up. Like so. Now we'll go over and stitch this. Make sure that you leave your gap, that 5-inch gap or so at the bottom. And if you want, you can place your hand on it and leave about a 1/2 inch on either side that isn't sewed of your hand. That way you know you can get your hand up in there. Okay, so while we're here, we're going to go ahead and box our corners. And now this is a standard boxed corner. We're going to line our side seam up with that bottom seam and just finger press open our seam allowance and put a clip on it on both sides. And then we're going to stitch across using the same seam allowance. Just make sure those seams are lined up nicely and everything will be nice and squared. I like to put a clip here on the side just to make sure everything stays where I want it and things don't shift. So you're basically pulling out the front and back and flattening those seams together. Alright, so that is our lining all ready to go. Corners are boxed out nicely. And we have that gap that is big enough to get our hand through in the bottom. So if you have an exterior label on your bag, you want to pay attention to where your zipper is at. So I want that to be on the opposite side of where my label is at. So I'm going to turn this so that the front of the lining is facing the same direction as the front of the exterior. And I'm going to poke my exterior down into the lining. And you're going to have to mush it a little bit because the lining is going to be a little bit smaller than the exterior. And I'm going to start by lining up my side seams and pressing open the seam allowance on the lining part and putting a clip there. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And then I want to line up the center, front, and back. I should have marked on my piece there, but I'm going to eyeball it with where my hardware is located in this case. So I know at some point somebody is probably going to want to do the exterior in a woven material. And I've actually started one myself. So before we move on, if you're using a woven material, let me grab these. Because of the way the connectors, and this is just an old pair of jeans, because of the way the strap connectors or the handle anchors are connected to this, you're going to want to use some fray check on this. because these areas here, right here, they don't get stitched. And that part can very well fray and poke out where your connector is. So we want to make sure that we're fray checking those areas. Now I have actually put Decaville Light on this because the denim was a little stretchy. So that's going to give my bag approximately the same amount of structure that vinyl would. So you're going to take your fray check and go on all of these edges where those little tabs are. Mine's not coming out, but you get my point. You're going to go where all of the tabs are, even on the lining pieces, and put some fray check, just so that doesn't fray and poke out. So that's a little tip for if you are going to try to use a woven material for the exterior of this bag. Okay, so now this part is super important. To line this up correctly, you're going to line up the tabs on the front and the back. So you're going to line up the tall tabs, this little notch, line up those notches so that they create a straight line. So hopefully you can see that there. And we're going to clip both sides of that. I like to just ease everything in where I want it and put a clip. We're going to do that on all four. Okay, now that we have everything clipped in place, we're going to go over and sewing with this side facing up on our machine, on our bed. We're going to stitch from tab to tab, or from notch to notch. So we're going to start even with the notch and stitch around even with the notch here, and then skip over. Don't sew across here, skip over, and sew from this notch to this notch. And we're going to do this all the way around the bag until all sides are sewn. Okay, so I've adjusted the camera angle so you can see a little bit better here. So it doesn't matter which scoop, I'm calling it, the little scoop you start at. You can start at any of them. I'm just going to kind of fold this back out of the way and remove the clip there at the beginning of that one. And move my work right under that. And drop my needle down parallel to that little tab. I'm going to make sure that I'm back stitching at the beginning and the end. We don't want these stitches coming out. Anytime you need to stop to remove a clip, put your needle. So now I've reached the end of that particular scoop. I'm going to raise my needle. I'm not going to trim my threads or anything yet. I'm just going to spin things around. And go right over to the next scoop, we'll call it. And drop my needle down parallel to the little notch there. So at this point we can kind of mush our bag in this direction and get it so that this area is straightened out a little bit. Making sure that the edges of our material are still even. So just keep rotating, moving over, and continuing around. So we have stitched all the way around. Now, one thing that I recommend doing here is, I've been tempted to leave these threads attached, but I found that when preparing our handle anchors, it makes it a little bit difficult to get them poked in where we want them. So I like to clip all of those little threads out of the way. So I'm just going to clip all those off, and then I'm going to clip all of my curves. It's very important to clip your curves so you have a nice smooth edge at the top of your bag and you don't have puckers. There we go, have all of those clipped. So I'm just going to go around and clip all of my curves. I'm clipping almost up to my stitches without clipping through them. Okay, now we are ready to turn out our bag. So I'm just going to reach through here and grab one side of the bottom and carefully pull everything out. So now this is what you should have. So at this point we're getting ready to pull out our tabs here. So you can actually kind of stick your finger in there and pull it out until you get to a certain point. Now you can use a chopstick or just your fingers if you like, but go on the side of the exterior. See, I've already managed to poke out the lining side. That's okay, I can poke it right back in there. But we're going to pull out the long tab on the exterior side, and the short tab on the lining side gets poked back in there. So you should have something like this. So that lining side stays poked in, that's the short tab, and then the long tab gets pulled out. I forgot the most important part before I turn this out, so I can do it here. So if you forget it, don't worry. We're going to snip that long tab right over to the side. It says in the pattern instructions to snip up to but not past the stitching. So you're going to do that for all of the long tab sides. This just makes it a little bit easier to finish it off. There we go. So now I'm going to poke the lining inside of the bag. I'm not closing up the bottom until the very end. You can sort of audition it, make sure everything fits nicely, and it does. So now what we're going to do is set this part aside. We're not going to top stitch yet. We don't top stitch until after we attach our handles. So now what we need is our 2 handle pieces and our 4 circle rings. Now if you can't get your hands on the O-rings and all you have is D-rings and that's what you want to use, then you can give that a go. I personally just really like the look of the O-ring. So what we're going to do is make a line down the center of both of our handle pieces. I'm going to use a red marker while I do this just so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to see the side back anyway. Or the back handle. There's one of them. I'm going to run double-sided adhesive down both sides of that, leaving about 1.5 inches at each end free of the adhesive. I'm going to set this aside. We're going to need it again in just a moment. I'm going to run my brayer over that just to make sure that everything is adhered down nicely. Now I'm going to start with one side and peel off the backing, and I like to start in the middle and press in and then work my way out from there. Making sure that I'm not stretching, I'm not pulling it this way because that can lead to twisting. And just so this isn't peeling up on me, I'm going to pop a clip right there toward the end. And now we're going to do the same thing to all 4 sides. Okay, now that we have both sides folded into the middle, we're going to feed 2 rings onto each one of the handles. Now these are 3/4 inch welded rings, stainless steel. So the inside is 3/4 inch approximately, and the exterior, the outside measurement is 1 inch. So I'm going to feed 2 onto it. I like to keep that there so that it doesn't come apart. And then I'm going to fold this together, right sides together, match up those ends, and then I'm going to stitch right across there on both of the handles. So I'm going to go over to the machine and stitch across there, and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we've stitched across the ends of both of these. I'm going to trim the corners off just so there's a little less bulk in the middle. Careful not to cut my stitches. So we have this now. So I'm going to remove that clip so that I can hold this open. I'm going to put double-sided adhesive in the area that I left it out before. And that's going to help hold that seam allowance open as well. So I'm just holding that open with one finger. And running double-sided adhesive down both sides of that line that we made earlier. I'm going to do the same thing on both of these. And I'm going to press that in place and remove my clips. Peel off my backing. Oops, peeled off all of it on that side. Then I'm going to fold this center in to meet, just like the rest of it. Now, yes, you're going to have a little bit of bulk right there, but not a ton. If you're using a domestic machine and it struggles with layers, you can probably get away with just hand cranking across that part and be just fine. So now I'm going to flip this so that it's exterior facing out and move my rings to opposite ends. Now I like to have that seam about 1 inch from one of my rings. And what I'm going to do is put those on opposite sides on the bag. So that's about 1 inch from the end. I'm going to put a clip right there and go to the other end and just put a clip right there. So now what we're going to do is when we get over to the machine, we're going to stitch across, down, across, and back up, and top stitch this, closing up those edges. I'm just measuring to make sure that they're about the same distance from the end on each one, just because I'm picky like that. Okay, so I'm going to switch up to red thread because I want that red top stitching. And then we're going to go over and top stitch. So this time I'm going to need to switch out my bobbin thread as well, because both sides of this handle are going to be visible. Alright, so I like to start at the end that has the seam there. So I'm going to start at this end with that seam face down on my machine bed. And I'm starting pretty close to my hardware. I'm just making sure that the edges of both top and bottom stay aligned as I'm stitching. There is one of our handles with some pretty red top stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other one, and I'll meet you back over at the counter. Okay, so now we have both of our handles attached, or all sewn together and attached to our rings. Now if you want, you can turn the welded portion so that it's underneath the end, just so you can't see that edge. Alright, so you can see there's a little bit of a bulge on each side there. I'm going to have them on opposite sides of the bag so that it's sort of like a feature. So now the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to fold these edges into the center, and I'm going to make a center mark and put a couple of pieces of double-sided adhesive. If you're using a lighter vinyl than this, or anything that has a little bit of stretch, I recommend doing as I do in the pattern and adding a little bit of Decaville light there just to reinforce. And you're going to want it to go down into, so a piece about 3 inches by a half an inch. So you want it to start here and go down into, because the top stitching is what's going to catch the end of this and hold that connector in place. So I'm going to put a line down the center of each one of these just to give myself something to line up to, and I'm using the edge here to square it up. And I'm going to do that on all 4 and add double-sided adhesive to those. So now at this point I'm going to kind of burnish that down, remove the backing, and I'm going to make sure that short tab stays tucked up in there. And then I'm going to fold this over just so that the edge meets that line. Okay? I'm going to do that for all 4 of the tabs. So it should be tapered so that it's wider at the base and narrower at the top. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to stand my bag up so that the exterior, one of the sides is facing me. I'm going to hold my handle so that the wrong side, the side with that seam, is facing me. I'm going to curve it around and hook it on both of those tabs, just like so. Then I'm going to take the tab and tuck it in to that opening there, until when I press here, I can just feel that this edge of the material is at the bottom of that ring, and I'm going to clip it in place. So I don't know if you guys will be able to hear it or not, but we got some thunderstorms rolling in, so hopefully I can get this done before the worst of it hits. But the wind is really rip-roaring out there. There we go. So put a clip on that. And now again, as you can see, that means that the wrong side of the handle is facing the inside of the bag. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side, but this time I want that seam on this side. It's over there, so I want it on this side, so I'm going to have that facing me. And hook that over. And tuck them in. There, so my handles are in place. Now we're ready to top stitch around the top of the bag. Now one thing that I like to do is, especially if you're using a flatbed machine, if you have a domestic that has the part that's removable so that you can fit this over the arm so you're top stitching on the exterior, that's great, do it that way. But with an industrial or other flatbed machines, so that we can sew on the pretty side, we want to top stitch on the pretty side. I'm going to turn my bag inside out. Now this bag is very forgiving. This way I can lay it flat on the bed of my machine and top stitch on the right side. You want to make sure that your handles are out of the way and you're not sewing the handle to the bag, so have them extended out. And we're going to top stitch all the way around, starting on one side, making sure our seams are rolled out. And we're going to make sure that we are catching this shorter piece of material here. So we don't want to go all the way up to, we want to come about 1/4 of an inch down from the bottom of that ring. That way we're catching the fabric or the vinyl on the inside of the bag. So we want to catch that piece there. My machine is still at a top stitching length, and I'm going to roll this hem out, or this seam out, and put that right under I'm going to make sure that this stays rolled out as I'm working all the way around. You can kind of look at the side and see where that material is, so I know that I can take at least one more stitch and still catch it. So I'm going to turn, and at this point you're just eyeballing it to make sure that you're going straight across. You can kind of see where the material is there. Make sure you're still tucked in. There we are. And ending about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the material. Again, make sure your seams are rolled out. And turn and go around your scoops. Okay, now we've top stitched all the way around the top of our bag. We're going to turn it right side out. So this is what we have. I'm going to go ahead and heat seal these threads here so they're not fraying. Now we're ready to close up that bottom. So I'm just going to pull this up, fold and finger press that in. Up the sides and stitch across with a short stitch length. You can absolutely put a few clips on here just to make sure the edges stay where you want them. You can also adjust however much you need as you're sewing the bag. Now make sure your handle is pushed back out of the way. I'm going to go back down to a short stitch length. And I'm sewing pretty close to the edge of the material, about a scant 1/8 of an inch. Not quite as small as a 1/16 of an inch, but smaller than an 1/8. Just making sure that I'm catching both sides of the material as I go. And that is it. Your bag is all done. So I'm going to poke this in. It's going to puff up a little bit at the moment because there's still air trapped between the vinyl and the waterproof canvas, but it will work its way out through the seams. And you can kind of adjust your handles so that they're centered. I'm going to turn this one so that that seam is underneath there. Okay. Snap that together, and there we go. There is our cute little dimple bottom bag. So this is the Madeleine. Now, of course, you can absolutely steam your vinyl, use a pressing cloth just to get any little wrinkles or anything out that might have gotten in there. But honestly, I don't mind it being a little, not really creased, but having those marks where you can tell it was creased at some point. It adds a little bit, almost like a leather. It makes it more like a leather look. So there we go. Our Madeleine tutorial is complete. I would love to see what you make. Don't forget to join the Facebook group. There is a link for that in the pattern as well as in the description box below. I will see you all next time. Bye! So I'm going to center the 1-inch square on the 1/2 inch. Oh my gosh, I'm making this so confusing. I'm so sorry. So